Berg says that almost all the courts of appeals have decided this question against you, and the leading commentators take the opposite position. How do you account for that?
So I think that's correct. I think these courts were writing, either now or at the time in a way that they were comfortable not following the literal text. Some of them acknowledge that they're not following the literal text, and this is just not consistent with the court's modern approach. I will say that most of these courts, at least 5 of them in the dissent, trace back to this D.C. Circuit decision from 1962, Austin versus Smith, that just didn't even mention Rule 60C1. But since, the coming of Justice Scalia in 1986, the court has taken just a different approach to statutory interpretation. And we cite an example of, I think it's U.S. versus Brogan, where all the courts of appeals had ruled 1001 gives you a right to lie, and this court just said, we're going to overrule that. And I think.
Welcome back to 45th Perspective, where we break down the stories shaping America and give you a clear, thoughtful analysis of what's really happening. If you're new here, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss any of our deep dives into politics, policy, and current events. And if you want to support the work we're doing here, consider joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/45thperspective for as little as $5 a month. Your support helps keep us independent and able to dig into these important topics with honesty and clarity.
Berg says that almost all the courts of appeals have decided this question against you, and the leading commentators take the opposite position. How do you account for that?
So I think that's correct. I think these courts were writing, either now or at the time in a way that they were comfortable not following the literal text. Some of them acknowledge that they're not following the literal text, and this is just not consistent with the court's modern approach. I will say that most of these courts, at least 5 of them in the dissent, trace back to this D.C. Circuit decision from 1962, Austin versus Smith, that just didn't even mention Rule 60C1. But since, the coming of Justice Scalia in 1986, the court has taken just a different approach to statutory interpretation. And we cite an example of, I think it's U.S. versus Brogan, where all the courts of appeals had ruled 1001 gives you a right to lie, and this court just said, we're going to overrule that. And I think just last term you ruled against a case I argued when all the courts had gone our way.
Well, speaking of last term and lost causes, what do you say about Hewitt and the...
Today, we're going to take a close look at a recent Senate hearing that has sparked a lot of debate across the country. This hearing focused on insert main topic of hearing here, e.g. federal spending, election integrity, national security oversight, and it featured some sharp questioning, pointed arguments, and, frankly, some moments that really highlight the deep divides in our government. I watched the hearing closely, and I want to walk you through the key points, the arguments from both sides, and what this could mean for everyday Americans. My goal is to give you a clear, balanced perspective so you can understand the stakes without all the noise and sensationalism that often dominates the media. To start, let's set the stage. The hearing was called to examine insert purpose of hearing, with senators from both parties questioning witnesses and each other about the policies, procedures, and implications involved. On one side, we had prominent senators or officials from Party A who argued that summarize Party A's main position. Their focus was on key points: fiscal responsibility, national security, accountability, fairness, etc. On the other side, we had prominent senators or officials from Party B who pushed back with concerns about summarize Party B's main position, emphasizing issues like civil liberties, economic impacts, transparency, etc. One of the most striking things about this hearing was the level of preparation and the way each side leaned into their priorities. For example, Senator A repeatedly emphasized the importance of policy goal or constitutional principle, citing specific examples from previous legislation or real-world outcomes. Their line of questioning was meticulous, pointing out inconsistencies in past actions and challenging witnesses to explain how the proposed policy would actually work in practice. At the same time, Senator B countered by highlighting the potential unintended consequences, arguing that opposite point and pushing for safeguards to protect ordinary citizens from negative fallout. What I found particularly interesting was how the witnesses responded. Often, the witnesses were caught between providing factual information and navigating the political tension in the room. In several moments, you could see them carefully choosing their words, acknowledging the challenges of the policy while also defending their implementation or recommendations. It's worth noting that in situations like this, the testimony can sometimes reveal more than the senator's statements themselves, because it shows the real-world complexity behind decisions that are often simplified in headlines. Now, let's dive a bit deeper into the substance of the hearing. One of the major topics discussed was specific issue, e.g., federal spending on healthcare, election security, climate policy, tech regulation. Senator A made a strong argument that policy position, pointing out that specific evidence or statistic. They emphasized that without proper oversight or reform, the system could lead to a negative consequence, affecting millions of Americans. On the flip side, Senator B challenged this view, arguing that alternative policy or critique, highlighting that overreach or rushed implementation could undermine public trust, create inefficiencies, or even violate established rights. This is where it gets really important for viewers to understand the nuance. In politics, rarely is one side completely right or wrong. The hearing illustrated that both perspectives have valid concerns. For instance, the push for specific reform is grounded in legitimate worries about accountability and efficiency. At the same time, the caution raised by the opposition reflects real risks that could affect everyday people, like economic costs, privacy concerns, local governance issues. Understanding this balance is critical because it helps citizens evaluate policies not just on ideology, but on practical outcomes. Another key theme that came up during the hearing was the historical context. Several senators referenced past cases, previous legislation, and long-standing legal principles to frame their arguments. For example, Senator A pointed to historical law or precedent, arguing that it established a clear framework for why policy is necessary. Meanwhile, Senator B drew attention to instances where similar policies in the past led to negative outcome, cautioning that history can provide lessons that shouldn't be ignored. This back and forth is essential to understanding not just the letter of the law, but the practical lessons we can learn from decades of governance. Something else that stood out to me was the underlying tension between federal authority and individual or state rights. This is a classic dynamic in American politics, and the hearing made it very clear. One side argued that a strong federal approach is necessary to ensure consistency and protect citizens from harm. The other side stressed that local and individual autonomy must be preserved, warning that federal overreach can sometimes create more problems than it solves. Watching these arguments unfold, you could see that both sides are motivated by a desire to protect Americans, even if their methods differ dramatically. The questioning also highlighted some broader political implications. For instance, the senators' focus on accountability, transparency, and oversight isn't just about this specific issue. It reflects larger priorities for their respective parties. Party A is clearly signaling that they want stricter enforcement and oversight, perhaps appealing to voters who are frustrated with bureaucratic inefficiency or corruption. Party B is emphasizing individual freedoms, local decision-making, and caution against rushed reforms, which resonates with voters concerned about government intrusion or unintended economic impacts. Understanding these broader political signals is key because hearings like this are often as much about messaging to constituents as they are about policy details. We also saw moments of sharp rhetoric and pointed questioning. Some exchanges were tense, reflecting the deep divisions in Washington right now. But even in those moments, I think it's important to separate style from substance. The heat of the debate can grab headlines, but the real takeaway lies in the facts and arguments presented. For instance, when a Senator A criticized specific policy or past decision, it was easy to focus on the tone of the criticism, but the substantive point about specific concern is what matters for citizens evaluating the policy. Similarly, when a Senator B pushed back with strong language, their underlying point about potential risks or constitutional concerns is worth paying attention to, regardless of the delivery. One of the most revealing aspects of the hearing was how each side addressed accountability. Questions about oversight, enforcement, and consequences for mismanagement were central to the discussion. Senator A pressed the witnesses on what mechanisms are in place to prevent abuse or inefficiency, and whether current laws are sufficient. The witnesses responded with a mix of acknowledgement and clarification, noting areas where improvements are possible, but also defending existing frameworks that have worked in the past. On the other hand, Senator B focused on the potential for overreach, emphasizing that stricter controls on federal agencies can sometimes stifle innovation or create bureaucratic bottlenecks. These are real trade-offs, and it's crucial for citizens to understand them when evaluating proposed reforms. Another important takeaway from this hearing is the role of data and evidence in shaping policy. Many of the arguments hinged on statistics, case studies, or historical outcomes. For example, Senator A cited data showing specific trend or problem, while Senator B highlighted research indicating alternative perspective or mitigating factor. This interplay between data and interpretation is central to policymaking. Two people can look at the same numbers and reach different conclusions, depending on their priorities, assumptions, and values. Recognizing this helps viewers appreciate why debates in Washington are often complex and why compromise is rarely easy. We also need to consider the broader implications for ordinary Americans. Policies discussed in this hearing may affect specific groups, e.g., taxpayers, small business owners, students, retirees, influencing everything from economic security to civil liberties. For instance, if policy is implemented without careful safeguards, it could lead to a negative impact, whereas careful, well-structured reforms could result in positive outcome. This is why hearings like this matter, not just to politicians, but to every citizen whose life is touched by federal policies. Now, let's talk about messaging and perception. One of the strategies used in hearings like this is framing, how a senator or witness presents information to shape understanding. Party A often frames the debate in terms of responsibility, fairness, and accountability, emphasizing the moral and practical need for reform. Party B frames it in terms of rights, risks, and potential unintended consequences, stressing caution and protection of individual freedoms. Both frames are valid in different ways, but they influence how the public perceives the debate. As viewers, it's important to recognize framing techniques so we can critically assess arguments rather than reacting purely to emotion or rhetoric. There were also moments where the senators acknowledged uncertainty or complexity. No single answer was perfect, and witnesses sometimes admitted that predicting outcomes is challenging. These admissions are significant because they reflect the real-world difficulty of governing a diverse, complex nation. Policy decisions are rarely black and white. They involve trade-offs, judgment calls, and balancing competing priorities. Watching this hearing, you could see the tension between ideal solutions and practical realities, which is something all citizens should keep in mind when evaluating government action. At the heart of this hearing, what we really saw was a microcosm of American democracy in action. Senators debated passionately, witnesses provided expert insight, and both sides made compelling points. The public may walk away feeling frustrated or conflicted, but that's part of the process. Democracy is messy, and hearings like this are where ideas clash, assumptions are challenged, and ultimately policies are refined. Understanding that process helps citizens engage more thoughtfully, rather than simply reacting to headlines or social media soundbites. So, what's my takeaway from this hearing? First, it reinforced the importance of oversight and accountability in government. Both parties are right to focus on this. Americans deserve transparency, responsibility, and policies that actually work. Second, it highlighted the need for caution and consideration of unintended consequences. Rushing reforms without fully understanding their impact can hurt more than help. Third, it reminded us that history and precedent matter. Looking at past successes and failures gives valuable guidance for current decisions. And finally, it showed the enduring tension between federal authority and individual or state rights, a debate that's central to our political system and one we should all pay attention to. I also think it's worth noting that these hearings aren't just procedural. They're a window into the priorities and values of our leaders. When we watch how senators question witnesses, what points they emphasize, and how they respond to challenges, we can gain insight into what they prioritize for the American people. That perspective is crucial for voters, activists, and anyone who wants to understand how decisions in Washington might affect their lives. Before we wrap up, I want to stress that this analysis isn't about taking sides. It's about understanding the facts, weighing arguments, and recognizing the broader implications. Both parties brought important points to the table, and both have responsibilities to the American people. Our role as citizens is to critically evaluate these discussions, ask questions, and hold leaders accountable. That means engaging with policy details, understanding trade-offs, and thinking beyond partisan talking points. I'd also like to encourage you, our viewers, to share your thoughts respectfully in the comments below. What stood out to you about this hearing? Did you notice points that I didn't cover? How do you think the issues discussed might impact your life or your community? Civil, thoughtful discussion is exactly what channels like this are designed to foster, and your input is a crucial part of the conversation. In conclusion, this Senate hearing offered a lot of insight into how policy is debated, how priorities clash, and how decisions are made in Washington. It reminded us that governance is complex, outcomes are uncertain, and every decision carries consequences. By paying attention to the facts, understanding the arguments on both sides, and thinking critically, we can become more informed citizens. And that's the goal of 45th Perspective. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next video, where we'll continue breaking down the issues that matter most to Americans today. Until then, stay informed, stay thoughtful, and keep questioning.